Hello and welcome. My name is Jo Frost and here with my co-host Peter Lynas. This is Being Human. Welcome back to another episode and another season of Being Human, which is kind of insane. This is our 7th season. That's mad. This is a little mini series. We're going to do 4 little episodes coming out over the next few weeks. We have been discussing how unstable our world feels, whether it's permacrisis, the meta-crisis, the vibe shift. The world feels shaky and the pace of change is consistently getting faster. We want to get behind some of the behaviours that we're seeing play out in our everyday lives and ask, what's really going on? And how might following Jesus lead us to respond differently? So, welcome to Season 7, Fear Makes the World Go Round. Peter, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. This is the first of our mini-series, and why are we in a mini-series, you might ask? Because Jo is leaving us, so we only have time for a mini-series before she leaves. You're going away. You're abandoning
leaving
me.
you. I've had enough. I'm finally getting out. Yeah, I'm off to OCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. So not a huge gear change, but slight relocation, not family, just job-wise. But it does mean that my time at Being Human is coming to an end, which is bonkers. But thank you very much for letting me have a swan song. I'm very grateful that we still get to get another season in.
Which Jo thinks means she's in charge of this one. This mini-series in which we will touch upon, at Jo's behest, I think, geopolitics, chaos, nationalism, power, truth, the tale of the two Tommies, more on that in another episode, Christian nationalism, AI, fear, the quiet revival, public discipleship, you name it. We will try and discuss it as we go along and bring some order to the chaos.
What are we discussing today, Peter? Why are we having this conversation in this moment?
Fear and chaos. We're going to talk fear and power and truth and what it means to be human. But like driving a lot of that is fear. So we're saying that what's going on in the world, well, you pull back the curtain and pretty quickly you say fear's everywhere. How much of what we are seeing is being fueled by fear rather than ideology, than conviction, than some sort of clear-headed strategy? Loads of it at a macro level, and we're going to talk probably more about that, the big picture, but also at a kind of micro personal level, how much of our lives are driven by fear. Everywhere we look, everywhere we turn, fear of the future, fear of failure, fear of getting it wrong, fear that we'll not make it through, fear about the whole creation and environment out there, fear of the unknown. You name it, we are fearful. And as we read the papers and lift the newspaper, or who does that still, look at the headlines on our phone, we're like, yikes, what are we going to wake up to next? What country will have been invaded?
So I was giggling to myself because I was listening to a predictions radio show at the beginning of the year. These journalists had stepped up and said, what are their predictions for 2026? And there was an announcement at the beginning of the show that said, this was recorded before Trump extradited the president of Venezuela this morning. And you're like, oh, literally day one of 2026. And it is all up in the air. Like your geopolitical bingo card for 2026 probably didn't have any of the things that came out in the first 7 days of January when Trump threatens military action on Greenland and kidnaps a Venezuelan president. And you're just like, this is our world. This is 7 days in. What are we doing? So, yeah, it's mad. And I think as I've been reflecting on what we could be discussing for this season, I think it was you that mentioned it to me, and we were talking about this idea about health and wellness trends and how much we've seen them emerge recently. And I was just thinking, okay, great, everyone wants to be healthy. But so many researchers are actually crediting the health and wellness trends as a response to fear and anxiety that came through COVID, that said we can get sick and we can die, and there are external forces out there that are going to truncate our lives, get healthy now. And so what looked like a perfectly reasonable, positive, get healthy, get fit, eat well, is actually coming out of a response of fear and anxiety because of what happened 5-6 years ago. Nobody wants to talk about COVID anymore. Like, we want to be over it. But the tail of it, psychologically and culturally and sociologically, is massive. And so as soon as that little light bulb came on, I've been seeing fear everywhere, and how fear is shaping the stories that we find ourselves in. I'm getting a little bit obsessed.
Yeah, well, I mean, our health service is in trouble and failing. So one part of it is people don't want to have to access it. So you want to be healthier. New Year's resolution's a big part of that. Somebody just WhatsApped me last night. They're on the Andrew Habermas stuff, which is Habermas. I don't know how you say his name. He was doing the cold water plunging every morning. He's in the sunlight every day. Those guys, yeah,
I don't follow him.
A lot of people following those kind of protocols. So, yeah, lots of people definitely getting healthy. Even on the tech world, the big question is for the year is AI. Are we on boom or are we on bust on that? Is the bubble going to burst on AI? Has ChatGPT peaked out? Have we all gone, it's amazing, and then gone, oh, but that's it. It's not going to get any further. It's fantastic. Some of the stuff it does. Is it going to nick all our jobs? You know, what's the environmental cost? Is this the end of humanity as we know it? So, you know, all these things drive fear in so many different directions. Even the conversation we're having about Trump, is it a nationalism conversation? Is he flexing his muscles against Russia and against China? Is he just trying to get the oil? Well, you used two different phrases. It was funny. You said he was extradited, essentially a legal phrase. And then you said he was kidnapped a minute later, both of which are arguably true. One half of listeners are going yes to the first bit, the other half are going yes to the second bit. Like, that's just the reality of the world we're in.
I mean, it's mad. It's mad. And then even just as you start talking about fear, uncertainty, NHS, so that makes me think, yeah, so much of the legislation that's being debated in Parliament at the moment, take, for example, the assisted suicide legislation that's coming through, and one of the primary stories that is driving the legitimacy of that is people's fear around the healthcare that they get at the end of their lives, the palliative care in crisis, lack of funding, lack of support, terrible deaths. And people are afraid of dying badly, so want the control back in order to be able to die well. And so that fear narrative is driving this legislation. And why it's so persuasive, because you can understand people's fears and anxieties. You see what's happened and you go, yeah, that's scary. Let's do something about it. And so as long as we are legitimizing, one, the fears that we have, and two, the human responses to that fear, we're going to see a whole range of problems kick into our society. And I think that's what I really want to explore.
And I was at an event just over Christmas that you'll never have been at because it was a 50th birthday party, you being so young, and a bunch of old people, possibly like me. But there was this very live discussion about what's our hope and aspirations for our kids. Now, one part of that was related to Northern Ireland, where I live, which is a somewhat failed state. We have a failed government, basically. But the second part was just in general, what would you like your kids to go and study or do in life? Do you want them to go to uni? That was the aspiration of my parents for kind of our generation to go. Then we're kind of almost going, well, we did that. They're not going to surpass our education probably. Are they going to get jobs that are better than ours? Should they bother? You know, it was almost this, what's our hopes for them? What would be good? Just, it was really interesting kind of range of people, most from a Christian background, but not all. And just as fascinating, but again, essentially underpinning it was this notion of like, we're a bit fearful. We can't see good pathways for our kids immediately in the way that maybe 15 years ago was just.
I don't even know if it was 15 years ago. I mean, I remember reading headlines that suggested that quality of life had peaked, that the boomers were the ones that were going to live the longest and the best life, and that we'd hit that peak, and now societally it is declining. The age that we die and the quality of life is now on the way down. But that's a narrative that's been around for a while. I remember I used to work with people that had been associated with Amnesty International. Now, obviously, that's quite an extreme charity dealing with pretty extreme human rights cases. But there was this narrative within the staff team where they didn't have kids. And if they did, if they were selfish enough to have children, they had one. And this was across the entire staff team, because there was this belief that why would you be so selfish to bring another generation into this world that's going to hell in a handbasket? And I found that fascinating. There was a PhD paper written on it, on the trauma and the fear that these people had encountered and what it had meant. Now play that out on a global, national, like societal scale. And you start to see that what was happening potentially in that little microcosm is starting to bleed into the way our culture works. And we need to tackle that, because fear is such a human response, but it's also such a broken one. And it leads to such unhealthy behaviors that at the moment we seem to be legitimizing.
So I think we've said, look, on the negative side, we're seeing it. People are economically fearful going forward. We're concerned about pensions or just money in the future, job security. We're seeing less grads being employed. There's that. You've got crime and drugs and things like that. We're concerned about some of the epidemics of that. Immigration is driving politics within the UK across the board. And there's if you like, a positive edge to that. We've seen this massive quiet revival, something we'll come back to, but there is an increased interest in faith. At least one of the drivers people are highlighting is fear. And that's just a reality. So that we're just acknowledging that those things are true. And I suppose the summary, at least for me, and you see what you, is essentially the chaos isn't going away. We have talked about the grey zone. We've talked about the perma crisis. We've talked about the space that we're in. That grey zone seems to be extending. I agree with Mark Sayers and others who say that we're in a bigger seismic change. This is a 50 or 100 or 500 year change. I think he actually thought we were through it a year or two ago. I think we're still absolutely in the grey. It's really unclear what's coming next. The speed of change is accelerating. And so we are stuck in at a meta level, a big level. We don't know what the next thing is. It's really uncertain politically and kind of socially where the future is going.
And that chaos that is still around is still driving change really quickly. And it is having a profound effect on every walk of life. That change, that uncertainty, that chaos is causing us on every level to be afraid. And that is changing the way we understand ourselves, the way we understand each other, the way we understand our past and our future. And we as followers of Christ have got to, one, acknowledge this storyline, and B, come up with the better story of hope in Christ. Okay, we want to dig in. But let me just take a moment to tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, we are on YouTube if you haven't found us there already. If you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, you can do it on any platform that you like. We're available on all the major ones. The favour we would ask of you, if you enjoy this podcast, please rate it. If you would like to find out more about the wider work of the Being Human Project, you can find us on beinghumanlens.com. You can follow either Peter or I on social media platforms. Keep in touch with us at beinghuman@eauk.org. In other words, there's loads of ways to keep in touch. And just because I'm leaving does not mean that Being Human is ceasing activity. And we'll be finding out more about what Being Human has in the pipeline in a later episode. So that's all happening. Life is good. We are not defeated yet. But like you said, it's a little bit daunting sometimes opening up a website or a news platform and finding out what the latest catastrophic headline is. Peter, what are your thoughts and reflections?
I think so. Fear can lead you to a couple of different things. You can essentially run away and retreat. And some of us do that at a kind of more personal micro level. You just step back and go, I'm not engaging in this thing. Fear can also lead to people saying, well, let's have a strong response, like everything's chaotic and the chaos is there. So some people thrive in that. Some businesses thrive in chaos. and like that. And some leaders thrive in chaos. We've said before in this that I think Putin is a force of chaos. He has designed chaos. It works for him. For small amounts of money, he tried to impact elections. He tried to push around in other countries and influence things. And now we're seeing that on a global scale. Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Venezuela, potentially Greenland, Panama. We're seeing the return, if you like, of the strong leader. Something we have talked about before, because that is one response to fear, is a strong leader. And people go, well, I want strength in this moment because I want somebody who promotes a strong response. And so we're absolutely seeing Viktor Orban and Hungary, so a number of stronger leaders across the world. And part of that strength is they will go and invade other countries because they're saying, do you know what? Some of the norms that were there before that led to stability just either don't exist. They're declaring that in reality and saying that's the case, or they're saying, why should they bother existing? Why should I play by the norms? They don't appear to have worked. I think that's partly true. Some of the norms there were suited a certain group of people, but they are also very happily now undermining a whole new set of norms. And there's some interesting things I think behind that.
Tell me about those norms. What do you mean by those norms?
International law norms, countries' boundaries norms, the way of doing things. You go to the UN, you try and resolve things. You know, you don't just invade another country, that we respect.
On New Year's Day and discover that the US has forcibly extradited a president of a different country.
That is true. You said it wasn't on anybody's bingo. It was on some people's. I mean, in one sense, they actually wrote a 30-page document where they pretty much declared they were likely to do this. I mean, that's what a few people are now looking back and going, oh gosh, they actually did tell us they were going to do this. No, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong.
But then similarly, how many people had on the bingo card that the US would threaten another NATO ally with military action, aka Denmark, Greenland? At the time of recording, nothing has happened yet. But you're right. The international norms, the bedrock of some of our international security policies, our defense strategies. None of these things seem to be playing out in normal terms. I remember looking back and thinking, when Israel was sending in missiles into Iran last year, and just thinking, okay, is this the moment that the Middle East truly erupts into war? And now we're looking and increased agitation against Russia and vice versa. And you're going, okay, is this the moment? And it feels like we're on a bit of a precipice of, are these norms being bent, or are these norms being broken? And I think that's scary. And I think people are feeling that fear.
I think it is. So firstly, if you'd watched Borgen, a brilliant Danish drama that was actually all about Greenland and China and Russia fighting over, you might not have known about the US invasion, but that would have been the only insight you might have had.
So are you basically saying your bingo card is full?
No,
is
no,
that
no,
what
no.
I'm
I
hearing?
didn't predict this. I'm not claiming that. But I did. Borgen, it was brilliant on it. That happened to be a quirky little show. I do think, so one thought I have is, I think the kind of deconstructing of postmodern norms that we've done in general, i.e. deconstructing the family and marriage, I think people are surprised at the implications of that. I've said this before, that I think the kind of deconstructionists and the pro-trans on one side were surprised that they bumped into Donald Trump on the far side of the moon, as I put it. He deconstructed from the other direction. Yeah, and they met each other and they were horrified to think that they are doing the same thing. But I think he's deconstructing a set of international norms in the same way as another group deconstructed a set of family and values norms, and they're playing the same game, and he's now out-gamed them. And while that, in one sense, makes me smile as they bump into each other, it's chaos for everybody. But I also think, I do think that Xi and Putin and others aren't playing by the international rules, and that we've maybe forgotten that this is what we call norm. I call the norm is a 70-year norm, and it's a little. One of the questions people are asking is, was this the blip post-World War II, essentially? And it was a norm, and it is a norm, and I think it's been a really healthy norm. It's a norm I've lived under, and if I've lived under, you definitely have lived under it. Even I, old as I am, have lived under this norm largely. Um, uh,
Are you feeling the age, Peter? Is it finally kicking in?
Wasn't it the McDonaldization of places? There were no two places McDonald's will ever go to war, and now they have. But for a long time, we lived in an incredibly stable time. So I think there's a couple of things going on that again are
Mm.
destabilizing. This is where we're pulling behind and saying, "This is the fear that's driving. What's the response to that?" We're not. I'm certainly not doing either of us are saying what's right or wrong. We're just analyzing a little bit about what's happening in this moment, and then what the reactions look like from people. A stronger nationalism, because people go, well, actually, I do want to see, I want some stability in a global world. It make America or whatever country you want to put in there great again. You can see why it appeals to a certain group. There is a populism that says, actually, I want something to cling to because I feel at sea. And Trump
Yeah.
offers that, and people go, yes. The first thing you have to do is understand why that's appealing. Reform in the UK and others is going to be appealing to some groups of people, and then we can engage with what's underneath it.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to understand that if we're living in a climate of fear, then everything is a fear response. So if Trump is a response to the fear of the instability and the shifts of the axis of power that America was experiencing, and the rise of emerging economies and a pull to the east. And so out of that fear, you wanted a much stronger leader. That's what happens. And then our fear response, rewriting the rule book, as it were, on the international scene. I don't really care about Europe. Why should I care about Europe? My home is here. I'm the Western Hemisphere. Thanks. You're not. Go away. And that's fear of influence. Our fear response is, gosh, if we can't rely on our ally, we need to increase our defense spending and we need to be more involved at a European level and we need to lean in other places. If you'd imagined 5 years ago that given the state of the UK's GDP and budget and finances, that there would be a strong popular drive to increase our defence spending, you'd have been laughed out of the room. And yet here we are responding, going, no, we've got to make sure that we can defend ourselves. We've got to make sure that we can protect our assets. We've got to make sure that we can protect who we are and what we need. We need to make sure we've got gas. We need to make sure that we've got communication cables protected. All of these things are coming out of a fear response of what we're seeing play out elsewhere, and so on. And
interesting, you said gas just in passing, but like oil and gas, so core commodities are things because we need the. So we need. If you're watching, I've done that. I need my phone. I need my computers. I need communications, and because I need these things, I need the stuff that supplies them. So we need rare earth materials, and who controls those? We need oil and gas. We are seeing the big global players move around to control those things. We need people to make things. We need communications. And we need some drugs, legal and illegal. And I think both of those things have an impact. So you could go down a whole list of things. And because of our needs, desires, wants, and we get a long conversation about where everything fits in those categories, that also drives our need to be a nation. Because we had free flowing trade for a long time. And then people said, actually, I can control this and I can leverage this. And people are doing it. It's quite a blunt, strong man response again. And it is usually men. So the Ubermensch, the strong man in this moment.
You see so many more protectionist storylines start to emerge, and again, it makes sense. These things are reasonable responses, which is why governments and leaders and politicians are advocating for these responses. But we have talked about these things. You've just mentioned the deconstruction idea that we talk about in Being Human, about this idea that you deconstruct power structures and you pull them down and you make them work for you. In the same way, our relationships with each other, the way our global relationships are playing out, are based at the moment on fear and desire. What do I want and what do I need? And how are those desires being threatened? What am I afraid of? And I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid you're going to hoard it. So I need to hoard it first. Exactly. I mean, we're constantly coming up against this when we live in a world, we're not in a connected community. that is circulating around an abundant, lavish, and good God, the only person that is going to look out for you is you. And if everybody's looking out for themselves, I have to be afraid of everybody else because nobody's going to look after me other than me.
Yeah.
And that really is Trump's entire justification for everything that he does.
I totally agree. Therefore, collectively, essentially, the question we're asking almost is international law effectively dead? I traveled through Nuremberg this summer with some friends, and we went to the courtroom where those trials were held. And the thing was, they essentially created international law because there wasn't anything before that. And they were able to say, actually, we all agree, it is universally agreed that simply because you're ordered to do it isn't an effective defense. There are underlying ideas that we can agree across the board. But actually, they didn't exist before, and they riffed and pulled very heavily from the Christian story. And likewise, there's almost a question, is democracy dying, stroke dead, or mutating? Because it's a very thin democracy we have in the UK. The reality is, in the most recent election, Labour won a landslide, but based on I can't remember the numbers now, but a couple of percentage it beat the Conservatives overall.
Yeah. Didn't Labour get less votes this time round than Corbyn?
I think that's true, and I think they beat the Tories overall by a few percent, but the seat difference was just ginormous. So you have you big questions about those, like the underpinning ideas, and those are being raised by those who are pushing the boundaries of them. And therefore, if my hope was built on that story, the story of international law and international rights, on democracy and parliamentary democracy in the UK, I'd be very fearful. I'm so glad my story is anchored on something deeper and bigger than that. And that those stories have riffed from and borrowed from the Christian stories, again, a theme we have driven and kind of repeated because it's true. So in this moment, am I fearful? Yes. I mean, that would be naive to say anything other than. I think one of the things we want to explore is there is a good and healthy and reverent awe and fear of God that we should have, but there is an unhealthy anxiety and fear. And I need to be careful of that. I would want to say that as somebody who looks at the news every day and go, oh my goodness, what's going on now? And I have absolutely scaled some of my news engagement back for that very reason. Because every day you can just be driven by that. And we need to be super careful. So I think massive changes are here, that the fear and power and truth. So the reason we flipped the title and played around is power trumping truth? Is power the dominant theme here? Or is truth ultimately always going to trump power, which is our belief, and is what we saw Jesus do with Pilate all the way through the text? But that you got to hold on to a deeper story for that to be true, and I think that's what we want to kind of land in on.
The argument that I think we've been trying to lay out is, one, the hypothesis that fear is driving so many of the storylines, behaviours and events that we're seeing play out on every level. Two, a lot of those responses are both simultaneously a reasonable response to a fear, but also fear-inducing. So we find ourselves in a circle of fear. And what we're also seeing, especially on the global stage, is a fear of speaking truth, of saying stop, of saying you can't just protect your own, you can't hoard, you can't subjugate another set of people just because you think you deserve or want or have the right to, or just merely have the power and the strength to take their assets from them. And so what we're seeing is a reluctance of those in some level of power to speak truth and to stand up against the strong men who have the bigger, more absolute power. And so what happens when, as a society, we are affected by fear responses of the powerful? And how do we find our Daniels and our Esthers who are able to persuasively and powerfully speak truth to those in power and offer a hopeful narrative as opposed to a fearful one? Where are those voices, and how do we pray them in?
Absolutely. And I think beneath that, I think this is the first time we've really had to wrestle with this. We've had to do it in small little bits, but I think essentially for Christians, our story, the God story, did become the global story of the West at the very least, and framed our global order. And so you were able to appeal back to this core story. And now that story isn't as clearly the anchoring story. And actually, even more than that, it is being used sometimes against us. It's being taken captive, the Christian story, sometimes to be used to justify actions that I don't think are Christian. And so we're really having to work through some of these. Now, I think some more conservative people might say we've been actually doing that for a while because some of the equality narrative and stuff has been used and we've had to think a little bit deeper. But I think now the real thing for us as Christians, we're going to have to think a lot deeper and anchor ourselves properly in the text to be able to make the case as to why some things we see in the world are wrong. Not simply because they're a breach of international law or are or aren't, but like the Nuremberg trials, we're going to have to almost recreate it and say, hold on, this is a breach of just moral right and wrong. And we're framing that out of a deeper understanding of what the text says here, the biblical text. And that has implications about how we engage with AI and ChatGPT. It has implications about geopolitics over here, about health over here, about each of those areas that we've talked about in the way in, and we'll probably circle back to a little bit. Because this is the beauty, this is where I get excited again, is without that frame, I have no idea how I do life. And it does give us a framing story and ideas and essentially principles I think we can draw from it to engage. But it's tough. And Daniel knew it was tough. We've never really had to do the Daniel thing, which is not only rely on the Christian story to speak truth to power, but rely on a power that's completely alien to that story and really push supernaturally into that space and say, you don't even buy my story. But not only is my story right is right and is supernaturally going to engage you in this.
I think that's spot on. I think the heavy lifting does need to be done. And I think we're probably going to push more into what is our story and how does it shape and form culture, and what does the co-opting of that story look like? I think we're going to press into that next episode. So come back for that. But the storyline that I'm coming to is, it, like you confessed in that moment, I think we can all confess to saying fear is a really, really easy emotion to experience. And our culture and our climate and the stories that we're immersed in are constantly reinforcing our need to be afraid. And yet, as followers of Jesus, invited into what it means to be truly fully human in him, we are consistently told by our story to not be afraid, to not allow ourselves to be dismayed or to dread, what am I going to read today? What catastrophic event is happening? Who's been hurt? Who's been harmed? What's happening to my friends? This dread that we are feeling is completely counter to the invitation of Jesus for us to find our home in him. And the text that I'm coming to, and the text that I think we might bump into a couple of times in this season, is 1 Peter, where the scattered church, the exiled church, the persecuted church in Peter's time, as he wrote this letter, were living countercultural lives, were responding to power and threats in a really unreasonable way, and yet were constantly reminded by Peter to respond not out of fear, but out of hope, because their hope didn't reside in how other people treated them or what their circumstances looked like. Their hope resided in the certain future of Christ calling them home. And I think for us as Christians, one of our key challenges in this season and in this climate is to not tolerate a justification for us to live our lives in fear. We have to live our lives in hope because our hope is certain. And it is not based on who our political leaders are. It is based on Jesus Christ and Jesus alone.
100%. So we're saying absolutely chaos isn't going away. The pace isn't slowing down. Clarity is hard. And we, like, naturally, I think as human beings, we want to regain control, but that's never the promise. It's becoming who we are and following the call of Jesus in the midst of it, not being in control of it. So it doesn't promise us certainty. It doesn't even promise us power in the sense of overall control. That's not to say we're not filled with the power of the Holy Spirit, but it does always offer us hope. And hope feels like it's absolutely the thing we always have to offer, but is so important in this season. It's not the vague optimism. It is a living hope. It's a reality. We are first fruits of that. We are the part of the royal priesthood in 1 Peter. We are living stones and royal priests, priestesses. Like, that's what we are to be, a living manifestation of that. And it's that faithfulness to God in this moment, and it's the hope that we share in this moment that is the set apart. And sometimes I listen to somebody else say something, I'm like, all this stuff, and all we've got to do is be hopeful. Well, no, yes and no. I mean, yes, that is it. It's a hopeful presence, a hopeful reality in communities that are inviting people in, because we are also seeing, and again, we'll talk more about this, that people in the fear are looking for something more. They want something that transcends. They want a faith beyond themselves. They want a community that engages them. So hope is not this abstract idea. It's absolutely rooted in real community, real relationships, real life.
Amen. Amen. And that is the invitation of what it means to be human, to live in hope in the real life. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope that this has been an enjoyable episode. Come back for season 7, episode 2 next week. Please do check us out on YouTube, subscribe to our podcast on your favourite platform, and get in touch with us at beinghuman@eauk.org. Until next time, take care and God bless.